What if the greatest strength in the unforgiving West wasn't the speed of a man's draw, but the resolve in his heart? What if a single act of kindness could unravel a web of cruelty and forge a love more resilient than prairie steel? This is the story of such a man, a solitary cowboy whose quiet world was about to be shattered by the arrival of a broken angel, and whose response would echo through the canyons forever. Caleb Hayes lived his life by the rhythm of the sun. It rose, painting the vast, empty plains in hues of apricot and rose, and he rose with it. It set, bleeding purple and indigo into the horizon, and he settled into the quiet solitude of his small ranch house, a fortress built not of stone, but of memories and loss. His face was a map of the frontier, etched with the fine lines of sun and sorrow around eyes the color of a stormy sky. He had lost his wife and child to a fever on the Oregon Trail years ago, a wound that had never truly healed, leaving behind a silence that filled the rooms more than any furniture could. His ranch, nestled in a protective crook of the Redemption Valley, was his penance and his sanctuary. He worked the land with a relentless energy, his powerful hands mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, and coaxing life from the stubborn soil. He spoke more to his horse, Dust, than to any human, his voice a low rumble that was rarely heard in the nearby town. He was a ghost, a good man hollowed out by grief, content to let the world spin on without him. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. On a day when the heat shimmered off the ground in dizzying waves, he saw it. A flicker of movement on the edge of his property, a stumbling, wavering shape that didn't belong. It wasn't a coyote or a stray longhorn. It was human. He squinted, his hand instinctively going to the worn grip of the pistol on his hip, a habit ingrained in any man who lived alone in such a wild land. The figure staggered, a flash of tattered blue fabric against the endless brown of the dirt. It was a woman. She took a few more desperate steps before her legs gave out, and she collapsed into a heap of exhaustion and despair, a forgotten doll tossed aside by a cruel child. Caleb swung himself into Dust's saddle, his movements economical and swift. He urged the horse into a gallop, the rhythmic thud of hooves eating up the distance. As he drew closer, the picture became clearer, and a cold knot tightened in his gut. Her dress, once a fine calico, was ripped at the shoulder and hemmed with grime. Her hair, a cascade of dark chestnut, was matted with dust and twigs, but it was the marks on her skin that made his blood run cold. A dark, ugly bruise bloomed on her cheek, and her arms bore the faint, ghost-like patterns of older, faded injuries. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the parched earth, and knelt beside her. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. Her eyes flooded open, pools of terrified green, wide and wild like a cornered doe. A whimper escaped her lips, and she tried to scramble away from him, a raw, primal fear propelling her. "Easy now," Caleb said, his voice softer than it had been in years. He held his hands up, palms open, a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here." Her terror was a living thing, a shadow that clung to her, and for a moment, he saw the ghosts of his own past in her frightened eyes. Would you turn away an angel with broken wings, leaving her to the vultures of the wilderness? Or would you gather her into your arms and dare the heavens themselves to try and take her from you? Caleb Hayes had already made his choice. He carefully scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile thing that felt as if she might break. As he carried her back toward the ranch house that had been his lonely refuge, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his solitude was over. Trouble had found him, wearing the face of a desperate woman, and he, in turn, would become its shield. He carried her across the threshold of his home, the scent of dust and desperation clinging to her. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke and old leather, a stark contrast to the unforgiving sun outside. He laid her gently on his own cot, the rough-spun blanket a bed of honor for this unexpected guest. Her breathing was shallow, a fragile rhythm in the quiet room. Caleb moved with a quiet efficiency that belied the storm of emotion churning within him. He fetched a basin of clean water from the pump and a strip of linen. As he sat beside her and began to gently clean the grime from her face, his touch was impossibly tender for a man whose hands were calloused and scarred from years of hard labor. He dabbed at the cut on her lip, his movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes, which had been closed in a state of near unconsciousness, flickered open again. This time, the raw panic was tempered with a sliver of confusion. She watched him, her gaze tracking his every move, her body tensed as if expecting a blow. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound. "Name's Caleb," he replied, not looking up from his task. "You're on my ranch." You collapsed out by the north fence. He finished cleaning her face and stood, moving to the small stove. You need water. And food. He worked without fuss, pouring a dipper of water into a tin cup, cutting a slice of bread from a loaf on the counter. He brought them to her, propping her up slightly with a spare pillow. She took the cup with a trembling hand, spilling some of the water on the blanket. She drank greedily, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat. She looked at the bread as if she hadn't seen food in days, then at him, a question in her eyes. "It's all right," he said, his voice a low reassurance. "Eat." She ate the bread slowly, methodically, as if relearning the act of nourishing herself. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of her quiet chewing and the ticking of a simple wooden clock on the mantel. When she was done, he took the cup from her. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt, like static on a dry day, passed between them. Her eyes shot to his, wide and searching. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question laced with a lifetime of suspicion. Caleb looked at the marks on her skin, the haunted look in her eyes, and the answer was simple, yet profound. Because no one else was, he saw the walls in her eyes begin to crumble, just a little. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust still clinging to her cheek. He didn't press her. He knew that stories, especially painful ones, had their own time for telling. He simply sat in the chair by the cot, a silent, steady sentinel. Night fell, and the coyotes began their lonely serenade to the moon. Inside the cabin, the lantern cast a warm, golden glow, creating an island of safety in a world of shadows. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible above the chirping of the crickets. "My name is Serafina," he nodded. Serafina, it was a beautiful name, one that felt out of place amidst such ugliness. She gathered her courage, her knuckles white as she clutched the rough blanket. She looked him straight in the eye, a flicker of defiance mixing with the fear. "You want to know what happened to me?" It wasn't a question. "Only if you want to tell," he said softly. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the words came tumbling out, a torrent of pain held back for too long. "My husband, he finds it amusing. The games he plays," she paused, her gaze dropping to her bruised hands. "He calls it a game, when he takes his belt to me. He says it's to teach me my place." Caleb's entire body went rigid. The air in the small cabin grew thick, heavy with the weight of her confession. Every protective instinct in him roared to life. He had seen the worst of the frontier, raids, stampedes, the slow, cruel death of drought, but this was a different kind of evil. A domestic, intimate evil that festered behind closed doors. She looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and delivered the final, devastating blow. "My husband hits me for fun," the words hung in the air, monstrous and obscene. In that moment, something shifted in Caleb Hayes. The hollowed-out man, the ghost who walked his own land, felt a fire ignite in the empty spaces of his heart. It was a cold, righteous fury. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and placed his large, warm hand over her trembling one. A silent promise. A declaration of war. Everyone in the valley thought they knew Caleb Hayes, the quiet rancher who kept to himself. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The dawn that followed Serafina's confession felt different. The light that spilled over the valley seemed sharper, the shadows darker. For Caleb, the world had been realigned on a new axis, and at its center was the woman sleeping fitfully in his cot. He offered her sanctuary without a second thought. It wasn't a choice. It was an imperative, as natural to him as breathing. He moved his own bedroll to the floor by the hearth, insisting she take his bed. When she protested, her voice still weak, he simply shook his head. "You need to heal. Rest is the first step." He made her a broth from a prairie chicken he'd shot days earlier, the simple meal a sacrament of safety. He watched as she ate, the color slowly returning to her cheeks, the haunted look in her eyes receding, replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. His loyal ranch hand, Gus, arrived with the morning sun. Gus was a man carved from the same tough timber as the land itself, with a face like a dried riverbed and a loyalty to Caleb that was absolute. He stomped onto the porch, took one look through the open doorway at the woman sitting at Caleb's table, and his bushy eyebrows shot up to his hairline. He pulled Caleb outside, his voice a low, concerned growl. "Caleb, what in blue blazes is this? You bringing strays home now? Human ones." Caleb's expression was unyielding. She was in trouble, Gus. Bad trouble. Gus spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Trouble has a way of following people, especially pretty ones with bruises that tell a story. You know who she is. Her name is Serafina, Caleb said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And she's staying, Gus sighed, a long, weary sound, and scratched at his grizzled beard. He had seen the look in Caleb's eyes before, the same quiet, immovable resolve he'd had when he decided to build this ranch from nothing after losing everything. All right, son. It's your land. But don't think for a second that her story ends here. Whoever did that to her ain't the type to just let her walk away. Gus's words were prophetic. But for now, the ranch was an island of peace. The days fell into a gentle routine. Caleb showed Serafina the simple chores of the ranch, not as a demand, but as an offering. A way to feel useful, to reclaim a piece of herself. He taught her how to milk the lone dairy cow, his large hands guiding her smaller, hesitant ones. He showed her how to mend a split fence rail, the shared task creating an easy rhythm between them. There was a quiet strength in her he hadn't expected. She was a quick learner, her fierce intelligence shining through the veil of fear. She began to smile, small, fleeting things that lit up her face and made Caleb's chest ache with a feeling he hadn't known in years. He would catch her watching him as he worked, her green eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that mirrored the growing tenderness in his own heart. The tattered blue dress was burned in the stove, a symbolic cremation of her past. Caleb had ridden into town at dawn one morning and returned with a simple, sturdy dress of soft green cotton from the general store, leaving it folded on a chair for her while she was outside. He never mentioned it. When she emerged wearing it, the color matching her eyes, he felt his breath catch in his throat. She looked like she belonged there, amidst the wild grass and the endless sky. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It's the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." He just nodded, unable to find the words, and turned back to sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a poor substitute for the hammering of his own heart. The sanctuary was holding, but Gus's warning lingered in the air like the distant rumble of a summer storm. They both knew this peace was borrowed time. The man who had put those scars on her, the man who treated cruelty as a sport, was out there somewhere, and he would come looking for what he considered his. The town of Redemption was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings baking under the relentless western sun. It was a place of commerce and gossip, where secrets were a currency and reputations were as fragile as spun glass. Word of a stranger at the Hayes Ranch traveled fast, carried on the whispers of the mercantile owner who sold Caleb the green dress, and the farrier who noticed Caleb buying supplies for two. Soon, the whispers reached the ears they were always destined for. Bartholomew Bart Creed was not a man accustomed to being defied. He was a freight magnate, his wagons carving dusty trails of commerce and control all over the territory. He was wealthy, handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, and possessed a charm as thin and brittle as ice on a winter puddle. To the town, he was a benefactor, a man of industry. But to those who knew him well, he was a tyrant, his generosity merely a tool to ensure loyalty and his temper a weapon to enforce it. When he heard the rumors, a slow, cold fury began to burn in his gut. His wife, his beautiful, timid Serafina, had run. And some solitary, dirt-poor rancher had taken her in. The insult was unbearable. Bart Creed and two of his hired men, thick-necked brutes named Jeb and Silas, rode into Redemption. They didn't storm in. Bart's methods were more insidious. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his polished boots a stark contrast to the dusty street. He moved with an air of absolute ownership, as if the entire town were merely an extension of his will. He started at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a man whose spine had long been replaced by Bart Creed's money. He greeted Bart with a nervous, ingratiating smile. "Mr. Creed, what an honor. What brings you to town?" Bart didn't smile back. His eyes were like chips of flint. "My wife, Sheriff. She's gone missing. I have reason to believe she's being held by a man named Hayes." Caleb Hayes, the lie was effortless, framing Caleb as a kidnapper, himself as the worried husband. Sheriff Miller wrung his hands. "Hayes? He's a quiet one. Keeps to himself. I can't imagine he'd—" "I'm not paying you to imagine, Miller," Bart cut in, his voice dropping to a silken threat. "I'm paying you to enforce the law. A wife is her husband's property. I want you to ride out there and bring her back." The sheriff swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Of course, Mr. Creed." Right away, back at the ranch, the fragile peace had been shattered by the arrival of a neighbor boy, sent by his mother who was one of the few people in town who valued decency over Creed's money. "Mr. Hayes," the boy panted, having ridden his pony hard. "There's a man in town, A fancy fella named Creed. He's saying you stole his wife. The sheriff's with him." Caleb's face hardened into a granite mask. He looked at Serafina, who had gone pale, her hand flying to her mouth. The terror was back in her eyes, stark and overwhelming. "He found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Caleb, you don't know what he's like. He'll destroy you." Caleb walked over to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze steady and unwavering. "He can try," he said, the two words a solemn vow. He turned to Gus, who was already checking the load in his old Winchester rifle. "Gus, stay with her. Keep her inside." Gus nodded, his expression grim. "Where are you going?" Caleb was already striding toward the barn where Dust was stabled. "I'm not going to wait for the wolf to come to my door," he said over his shoulder. "I'm going to meet him on the road." The shadow that had been looming on the horizon was no longer distant. It was lengthening, stretching its dark fingers toward the small sanctuary he had built, and Caleb Hayes was riding out to meet her head-on. He would not let the darkness touch her again. The dust kicked up by Dust's hooves was a plume of defiance against the afternoon sky. Caleb rode not with the reckless speed of a hothead, but with the steady, implacable pace of a man whose mind was set. He knew confronting Bart Creed in town, surrounded by the man's influence and bought-off lawmen, was a fool's errand. The road was neutral ground. He met them halfway between his ranch and redemption, a lone rider blocking the path. Sheriff Miller, flanked by Bart and his two thugs on horseback, pulled his horse to a nervous halt. Bart Creed's lips curled into a sneer. "Well, well. The brave farmer comes to parley. This must be Caleb Hayes." Caleb ignored him, his gaze fixed on the sheriff. "Miller, you know me. You know I'm not a troublemaker. You need to turn your horses around and ride back to town." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Caleb, Mr. Creed here has filed a complaint. He says you've taken his wife." "That's a serious accusation. The only thing I've done," Caleb said, his voice low and clear, "is give shelter to a woman who was beaten and left for dead. You should be arresting him, not me." Bart laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the quiet air. "She's my wife. I have the right to discipline her as I see fit. The law is on my side. Now, step aside, farmer, before my associates are forced to move you." Jeb and Silas, the two hired men, nudged their horses forward, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. They were big men, used to solving problems with brute force. Caleb didn't flinch. His hand remained loose, nowhere near his own weapon. He was not starting this fight, but he would surely finish it. "She is not your property, Creed," Caleb stated, his voice ringing with a conviction that gave the simple words immense power. "She is a human being, and she is under my protection. You will not lay a hand on her again." The sheer audacity of it stunned them for a second. This quiet rancher, this nobody, was openly defying Bartholomew Creed. Bart's face contorted with rage, his charming facade melting away to reveal the monster beneath. "Protection. You can't even protect your own dirt patch of a ranch. I will ruin you, Hayes. I will take everything from you, and when I'm done, I'll take her back and teach her a lesson she'll never forget. And I'll make you watch." The vile threat hung in the air. That was it. The line had been crossed. Still, Caleb held his ground, his calm a stark contrast to Bart's sputtering fury. "Get off my road, Creed. This is not your road." Bart shrieked. "This is my valley." "Then you should know," Caleb said, his eyes as cold as a winter creek, "that we don't take kindly to men who hide behind money and hit women. Go back to town. This is your only warning." For a moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Jeb's hand twitched, but something in Caleb's stillness, in the absolute certainty of his gaze, gave them pause. This wasn't a scared farmer. This was something else, something they hadn't accounted for. Bart, ever the bully, preferred his violence to be easy and one-sided. A public gunfight was messy and unpredictable. He pulled on his reins, his face a mask of black hatred. "This isn't over, Hayes. You've made a powerful enemy today." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. "Let's go, Miller. This coward will be dealt with in a more legal fashion." They rode away, leaving Caleb alone on the road. He watched them go, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders, replaced by a grim certainty. This was just the beginning. He had won the standoff, but Creed had revealed his next move. He would use the law, twisted and corrupted by his wealth, as his next weapon. Caleb turned dust back toward the ranch, a cold dread mixing with his resolve. The confrontation had brought the danger out into the open, but it had also forged something new between him and Serafina. They were no longer just a protector and a victim. They were allies in a war they had to win, and in the crucible of that shared danger, the sparks of attraction that had been smoldering between them were about to ignite into a powerful flame. He returned to the ranch to find Serafina on the porch, a rifle held awkwardly but firmly in her hands, with Gus standing beside her. The relief that washed over her face when she saw him was so profound it was almost painful to watch. She set the rifle down and ran to him as he dismounted, stopping just short of throwing her arms around him. "You're all right," she breathed, her eyes searching his face for any sign of injury. "I'm all right," he confirmed. They've gone. For now, that evening, the mood in the small cabin was thick with unspoken emotions. The threat of Bart Creed was a palpable presence, a third person at their simple dinner table. After they ate, Gus, with a wisdom that transcended his rough exterior, made an excuse about checking on a lame horse and left them alone. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Serafina sat on the small stool, her hands clasped in her lap. Caleb leaned against the mantel, the firelight carving his rugged features into sharp relief. The silence was not awkward, but filled with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly, breaking the quiet. "You shouldn't have put yourself in danger for me." He looked at her, his stormy eyes softening. "I told you. You're under my protection. That's not a promise I make lightly." He pushed himself off the mantel and sat in the chair opposite her. "Serafina, I need to ask, why did you stay with him for so long?" The question was gentle, born of a need to understand, not to judge. She looked into the flames, her mind traveling back to a place of pain. "When I first met him, he wasn't like this. He was charming, powerful. He promised me the world. I was an orphan, working as a seamstress. I had nothing. He seemed like a fairy tale." Her voice grew quieter, laced with the bitterness of betrayal. The fairy tale soured quickly. It started with small things. A sharp word. A possessive grip on my arm. Then the games began. At first, I was too ashamed to tell anyone. Who would believe me? And then, I was too afraid. He isolated me, made sure I had nowhere to go. He owned the town, the sheriff. He owned me. I thought there was no escape." Caleb listened, his heart aching for the lonely, terrified girl she had been. He understood that kind of cage, the invisible bars of fear and despair. He felt compelled to share a piece of his own brokenness, to show her she wasn't alone in her pain. "I had a family once," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A wife, Martha, and a little girl, Sarah. We were heading west, full of dreams. Just outside of Laramie, a sickness took them. Both of them, in less than a week." He stared into the fire, seeing faces in the flames that only he could see. "I buried them myself, under a lone cottonwood tree. For a long time after that, I felt like I was already dead too. I built this place to be my tomb. A place to just wait for the end. I couldn't protect them. I failed them." A tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the trail dust on his cheek. Serafina reached out, her fingers gently touching his hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact, a simple, profound gesture of comfort. "You didn't fail them, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You couldn't stop a fever any more than I could stop a monster's fist. Some things, they just happen. The only thing that matters is what we do after." Her strength, forged in the fires of her own private hell, was a lifeline to him. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. Her skin was soft against his calloused palm. In that moment, by the flickering firelight, two broken souls found solace in each other. Their shared vulnerability was a bridge, connecting the desolate islands of their pasts. The air between them shifted, charged with a new energy. It was no longer just about protection and gratitude. It was about connection, a deep, resonant understanding that transcended words. He looked from their joined hands to her face, her green eyes luminous in the firelight. He saw not a victim, but a survivor. A warrior, and he was falling in love with her. The next few days were a tense calm before the inevitable storm. Bart Creed was true to his word. Instead of returning with thugs and guns, he attacked with paper and ink. A notice, delivered by a smirking deputy, was nailed to Caleb's front door. It was a foreclosure summons. The document, filled with dense legal jargon, stated that Caleb's late father had taken a loan from a freight company years ago, using the ranch as collateral. That company had since been acquired by Creed Enterprises. The loan, with exorbitant interest, was now due in full. The amount was staggering, a sum Caleb could never hope to produce. He was given 30 days to pay, or the ranch would be seized. It was a masterful, cruel trap. Bart wasn't just trying to get Serafina back. He was trying to utterly destroy the man who had dared to help her, to salt the very earth of his existence. Caleb stood on the porch, the paper crushed in his fist, a cold, helpless rage washing over him. This ranch was more than land and wood. It was the last tangible piece of his family. It was the place where his father had toiled and died, the place where he had intended to live out his own quiet days. Losing it would be like losing his family all over again. Serafina read the notice over his shoulder, her face draining of all color. The weight of the guilt was crushing. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice choked with despair. "He's doing this because of me. Caleb, I can't let this happen. I can't let you lose your home." Caleb turned to face her, his expression grim but resolute. "This is not your fault, Serafina. This is his. This is the act of a coward who can't win a fair fight, but he will win," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "He has all the money, all the power. He'll take this place from you, and it will be because I brought this trouble to your door that night." She couldn't sleep. The thought of Caleb losing everything because of her was a torment. Before the sun had even hinted at its arrival, she made a decision. She scribbled a hasty note on a piece of scrap paper, her tears smudging the ink. "Caleb, I cannot be the reason you lose everything. Thank you for showing me what kindness looks like. I am going back. It's the only way to save your home. Please, don't come after me. Serafina." She dressed quietly in the dark, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She slipped out of the cabin, the cool pre-dawn air a shock to her system. She was halfway to the main road, a small bundle of her few belongings in her hand, when a voice cut through the darkness. "Leaving so soon?" She whirled around. Caleb was standing there, leaning against the corral fence, a silhouette against the first pale light of dawn. He must have known what she was planning. He must have been waiting for her. "You have to let me go," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "It's the only way." He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his tall frame blocking out the nascent light. He gently took the bundle from her hand and let it drop to the ground. "I already lost one family," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "I'm not about to lose another, but your home, this is just land and wood," he said, gesturing to the ranch around them. "It was an empty shell before you came. You brought the light back." He reached up and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb gently stroking her cheek where the bruise had once been. "I'm not giving you up, Serafina. And I'm not giving this place up. We are going to fight him." Together, the raw sincerity in his eyes, the unwavering strength in his voice, washed away her fear and guilt, replacing it with a surge of hope so powerful it made her dizzy. He wasn't choosing the ranch over her, or her over the ranch. He was choosing them. He was choosing a future he hadn't dared to dream of. "How?" she whispered. "How can we possibly fight him?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, his gaze intense. "But I know I'm not fighting for a piece of land anymore. I'm fighting for us." He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion, but of profound, heartfelt promise. It was a kiss that sealed their alliance, that bound their futures together. In that moment, under the vast, awakening sky, they were no longer two broken people. They were a fortress. And Bartholomew Creed was about to find out just how strong their walls were. The decision to fight back sent a ripple of change through the small ranch. Despair was replaced by a quiet, determined industry. Caleb was no longer just a man protecting a guest. He was a man defending his future, his partner standing firmly by his side. Serafina, freed from the burden of guilt and empowered by Caleb's devotion, revealed a core of pure steel. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a strategist. "We can't beat him with money or with the law he controls," she said one evening, as they pored over the foreclosure notice by lantern light. "But he has a weakness. His pride. His reputation is everything to him." Gus, who had been a silent observer, finally spoke up, tapping a gnarled finger on the paperwork. "There's something else here. This original loan document. The signature for the lender ain't Creed's. It's a man named Abernathy. Silas Abernathy. I knew him. He ran a small freight line before Creed came along and, well, before Abernathy's business mysteriously burned to the ground and he left the territory with his tail between his legs, a new path began to form in the darkness. They couldn't prove Creed was a monster in his own home, but perhaps they could prove he was a shark in his business dealings. Caleb rode out, not to town, but to the small, scattered homesteads in the valley. He spoke to farmers and ranchers, men and women who had also been squeezed by Creed's ruthless expansion. He didn't ask them for help in a fight. He simply listened to their stories. He heard about unfair shipping rates, about land deals that went sour, about threats and intimidation. Individually, they were all too scared to speak up. But Caleb's quiet defiance was a spark in the tinder. He returned to the ranch not with an army, but with something more powerful, a collection of grievances, a shared history of being wronged by the same man. Gus, meanwhile, used his own network of old-timers and gossips. He sent a letter via a trusted stagecoach driver to a town 2 territories over, trying to find any trace of Silas Abernathy. While they waited, the bond between Caleb and Serafina deepened into an unshakable partnership. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their conversations a mix of strategy and the quiet discoveries of 2 people falling deeply in love. He learned she had a wry sense of humor, a sharp wit that had been buried under years of fear. She learned that his stoicism was a shield for a heart of profound tenderness. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of the roof on the barn, a task that brought them close under the hot sun, he paused and looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair tied back in a simple knot, and to him, she had never been more beautiful. "When this is over," he said, his voice serious, "I want to marry you, Serafina. I want to build a life with you." Right here, her eyes widened, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. "I think," she said, her voice catching with emotion, "I would like that more than anything. It wasn't a proposal made on bended knee with a ring, but a declaration made on a barn roof with a hammer in hand, and it was the most real and romantic moment of her life. It was a promise of a future they were now fighting for with everything they had. The day before the foreclosure deadline, their gamble paid off. The stagecoach driver returned with a letter. Gus had found Silas Abernathy. The man was living a quiet life as a blacksmith, but he had never forgotten what Bart Creed had done to him. The letter contained a sworn affidavit. Abernathy testified that Creed had forced him to sell his company for pennies on the dollar after arranging for the fire that ruined him. More importantly, he confirmed that the loan to Caleb's father had been forgiven years before Creed's takeover, as a gesture of goodwill. The foreclosure was a complete fabrication, built on fraudulent documents. They had him. They had the truth. And it was a weapon far more powerful than any gun. The morning of the foreclosure was bright and clear, the sky a deceptive, peaceful blue. Bart Creed arrived not with an army of thugs, but with the air of a man attending to a simple business transaction. He was flanked by Sheriff Miller and a single clerk, a man carrying a ledger and a deed of ownership. Creed expected to find a defeated Caleb Hayes, ready to pack his belongings and slink away in shame. Instead, he found Caleb and Serafina waiting on the porch, not with rifles, but with a quiet, unnerving confidence. And they were not alone. Standing in a semicircle in the yard were a dozen other ranchers and farmers from the valley, the very people Caleb had spoken to. They were silent, their arms crossed, their presence a testament of solidarity. Creed's smile faltered. "What is this, Hayes? A farewell party?" "Something like that," Caleb said calmly. "But we are not the ones leaving," he stepped forward, holding up the affidavit from Silas Abernathy. "This is a sworn statement. It says the loan you're trying to collect was forgiven and paid in full 5 years ago. It says this foreclosure is a fraud." The clerk's eyes went wide. Sheriff Miller took an involuntary step back. Bart Creed's face, however, hardened into a mask of rage. He laughed, though it was a brittle, hollow sound. "A piece of paper from a disgruntled failure? That proves nothing. This land is mine." "Is it?" Serafina's voice cut through the air, clear and strong. She stepped beside Caleb, no longer the frightened woman who had collapsed at his fence line, but a figure of immense strength. She looked directly at Creed, her gaze unwavering. "Or is it just another thing you tried to take by force, like you did with Abernathy's business? Like you tried to do with me?" She then turned her attention to the assembled farmers. "This man preys on the weak. He uses fear and fraudulent paper to take what he wants. He told me that this valley was his. But it's not. It belongs to all of us." A murmur went through the crowd. One of the farmers, A man named Peterson, whose water rights Creed had tried to steal, stepped forward. "She's right. He tried to choke my farm dry last year," another spoke up, and then another, their individual stories of intimidation and financial bullying coalescing into a chorus of accusation. The foundation of Bart Creed's power, the illusion of his legitimacy and the fear he inspired, was crumbling before his eyes. He was being exposed not as a powerful businessman, but as a common thief and a bully. He looked at Sheriff Miller for support, but the sheriff, seeing the tide of public opinion turning so decisively, suddenly found the dust on his boots intensely interesting. Miller was a creature of political survival, and he could see that Bart Creed was no longer a winning horse to back. Creed, stripped of his authority and his allies, finally snapped. His rage, no longer controlled, erupted. He lunged, not at Caleb, but at Serafina, his face a contortion of pure malice. "You worthless." He never finished the sentence. Caleb moved with lightning speed, intercepting him. He didn't throw a punch. His response was far more humiliating. He simply grabbed Creed by the front of his fancy coat, lifted him clear off the ground with one arm, and held him there, squirming and flailing like a child in a tantrum. The sight was shocking. The powerful, fearsome Bartholomew Creed, rendered utterly powerless and pathetic. "You will never," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that carried across the silent yard, "touch her again. You will never set foot in this valley again." He then unceremoniously dropped Creed in the dust. Bart scrambled to his feet, his fine clothes covered in dirt, his dignity shattered. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of the farmers, at the sheriff who refused to meet his eye, at Serafina standing tall and unbroken, and finally at Caleb, the quiet man who had become an immovable object. There was nothing left for him here. Defeated, humiliated, and exposed, he turned without another word, climbed onto his horse, and rode away, not as a magnet, but as an outcast. The showdown was over. No shots had been fired, but a war had been won. With Bart Creed's departure, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the valley. The tense silence in Caleb's yard broke as the assembled farmers began to talk, to clap Caleb on the back, to shake his hand. They looked at him with a new respect, not just as a neighbor, but as a leader. They looked at Serafina with admiration for her courage. She had given them a voice. Sheriff Miller, seeing his opportunity to get back on the right side of things, cleared his throat loudly. "Well, that settles that. It's clear a great injustice has been attempted here. I'll be sure to file a report and make sure Mr. Creed faces consequences for his fraudulent claims. No one believed him, but it didn't matter. Creed's power in redemption was broken. He would never return." As the neighbors began to disperse, heading back to their own ranches with a renewed sense of community, Gus came up to Caleb and Serafina, a rare, wide grin splitting his weathered face. "Told you she was trouble, son," he said, winking at Serafina. The best kind. Caleb wrapped an arm around Serafina's shoulders, pulling her close. She leaned into him, the warmth of his body a comforting anchor. They stood on the porch, watching as the last of their neighbors disappeared over the rise. The ranch was safe. Their home was safe. They were safe. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, profound joy. The shadow of fear was gone, replaced by the bright sun of a shared future. The work of the ranch continued, but it was no longer a solitary penance for Caleb. It was a joyful, shared labor. They worked together, ate together, and sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky. Their love, forged in peril and tempered by courage, was a quiet, steady flame that warmed every corner of the small cabin. A few months later, with the autumn leaves turning the valley into a tapestry of gold and crimson, they were married. The ceremony was simple, held right there in the yard where they had made their stand. The officiant was a traveling preacher, and their guests were Gus and the dozen families who had stood with them. Serafina wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and in her hair was a crown of wildflowers Caleb had picked for her that morning. As they said their vows, looking into each other's eyes, they were not just making a promise to each other, but celebrating a victory of the human spirit. They had faced down cruelty and greed, and they had won not with violence, but with integrity, community, and love. The lonely ranch was no longer a tomb of past sorrows. It was a cradle for a new life, filled with laughter and hope. Caleb, the man who had thought his heart was buried under a cottonwood tree, found it was not only alive but capable of a love deeper than he had ever imagined. Serafina, the woman who had thought she was property, discovered she was a queen, ruling over a kingdom of her own making, her throne a simple wooden porch swing next to the man who cherished her. They say the West was a harsh and unforgiving land, won by men with iron in their fists and ice in their veins. But perhaps that's only part of the story. Maybe the West was truly won by the quiet heroes, the Caleb Hazes of the world, whose greatest strength was not in their guns, but in their capacity to love and protect. It was won by the survivors, the Seraphinas, who refused to let their spirits be broken and who rose from the ashes to build a new life. What do you believe wins in the end? Brute force or a courageous heart? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are inspired by this story of a love that conquered all, don't forget to like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that even in the darkest of times, kindness is the ultimate act of rebellion.